This video is going to discuss task analyses. So on the screen in front of you, we have a sample data sheet used for task analyses. At the top, you can see that you'd have the student name, the program that you'd be running, the dates that maybe you'd be implementing this program, and such. And then you have your steps 1 through 10, so the task will be broken down into the different steps. Then to the right of that, you would have what the staff would say to start that skill, prompt them through how to score it, and then what mastery criterion would be. And then at the bottom, you can see a grid designed for taking data on steps 1 through 10. Notice that the 1 is at the bottom and the 10 is at the top, so that as you progress across time or across the x-axis, hopefully you would see more of those steps being mastered. So if we think about a task analysis and what it is used for, a task analysis is just a fancy way of breaking down a procedural skill into separate steps to see if the different steps of that skill are mastered. So if we think about different procedural skills, one might be tying your shoes, another might be making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, another might be packing up your folder at the end of the day to take home your worksheets to your parents. All right, so all of those are skills that need to be independent. However, if you think about the skill overall, it is not something that is done after in a discrete fashion, but instead it is a procedural skill is done over time. So with those skills, we can break them down, take the task, and analyze it into separate steps. Right? So if we think about the skill perhaps of packing up your folder at the end of the day, we could break that down into separate steps. The first step might be listening to the teacher's instructions until the teacher is done talking. The second step might be standing up and walking over to where your folder is. Third step is getting that folder and taking the folder to your cubby. The fourth step would be gathering all the papers in your cubby. The fifth step would be putting all of those papers into your folder. The sixth step would be then to close your folder. Seventh step would be to put your folder into your backpack. The eighth step would be zipping up your backpack. The ninth step would be returning to your seat and sitting down. And the 10th step might be checking that off of your list of things to do, your checklist, right? So if we think about that as a procedural skill, we've obviously broken it up into 10 different steps. Now, this is just a sample data sheet. Sometimes skills have many more steps that need to be completed. Sometimes they have less or fewer steps to be completed. So it's dependent on the skill. And it also is dependent on the skill level. If you have a student who's just missing a couple of steps in an overall skill, right, you may not have to take data on all the steps. You might just target the couple of steps where the errors are occurring. Or you might have a student who needs many more fine steps put in between because it's not chunked enough. Right? They need to have many more steps in order to complete something independently. So it really is dependent on the factors about a particular student. So if we think about how we might use staff language for this particular skill, it might be that you actually want your staff to remain silent because, in fact, you want the student to follow directions of the teacher and attend to the teacher. The prompt might include maybe visual schedule, right? So that, again, you are trying to increase independence. Or it might be gestural, so it might be pointing to the visual schedule or pointing to the next place that the student needs to walk. How to score it, often we use a plus sign for independent, P for prompt, and a minus sign for not independent, right, an error. And then for the mastery criterion, whatever you set, maybe 3 consecutive days at 100% or 5 consecutive days at 80%, whatever you think is the mastery criterion for mastering that particular step or for the entire skill. And then again, at the bottom, you can see the data, right? So as we go across, we can see a mountain of data progressing. So maybe on the first day, we only have a couple of steps that were pluses. Maybe the third day, just 2. Maybe the third day, we have 3 pluses. So again, over time, you can see, visually analyze that the student is indeed progressing and mastering this skill. Often task analyses are paired with visual schedules because the visual schedule also breaks down a task into the smaller components to the level that the student needs to be independent. So together, pairing a task analysis with a visual schedule for a particular task is often a great way to analyze progression in that skill as well as accommodate the student for independence. So those two things paired together usually work well. When we think about teaching a task that has many steps to it, there are three common ways to teach that task. One is a total task, total chaining, where you do all of the steps every single time and you just prompt when necessary. Another way is forward chaining, where you expect the student to start the steps and then maybe you help finish those steps with the student. And the third way is backwards chaining, where perhaps you start the task for the student and then the student helps to jump in and then maybe they end the task independently, right? And there's different reasons to use the different teaching procedures. So you might use forward chaining if a student has attention issues, right? We really want them to pay attention to what the teacher is saying and then start the task independently. So we're targeting that ability to follow directions, that receptive language piece. So if that's the thing, we want to target forward chaining. We would expect the student to maybe start the first couple of steps and then we would help prompt them through the end. If the targeted deficit is motivation, we might use backward chaining, where we might start the task for them and then they take over and end the task so that they can then contact the immediate reinforcer afterwards for completing the task. So we're motivating them to do it. And so with forward chaining, we would just slowly add on steps so the student would have to compete for themselves. So we would, add on maybe step 3 and then step 4 and such. And then backwards chaining, right, we would add on from the end. So maybe the first step they have to do independently would be step 10, and then we would expect them to do steps 9 and 10, and then 8 through 10, and so on. So again, it matters about what is the deficit for that student, whether it's a motivation deficit versus an attention, let's say, deficit or skill deficit, that might determine why we would use forward chaining versus backward chaining. When we think about an error correction for a task analysis, the best way to correct an error is to back up to the previous step that was mastered and start from there. So if you encounter a couple of days where an error is consistently occurring at a particular step, you want to back it up to maybe like they're doing backwards chaining and they're consistently getting steps 8 through 10 correct, but there is an error with step 7. Right? So we want to back it up, have them do 8 through 10, get that immediate reinforcer for completing 8 through 10. And then the next day, when you do this, you might actually have to add a step in. You might have to make it 11 steps, where step 7 is broken down even into smaller chunks because you notice why that error is occurring. And so that's how you would do an error correction for task analysis. If you're doing forward chaining, same thing, right? They can do steps 1 through 3 maybe independently. But when it comes time for actually gathering up their papers, once they've made it to their cubby with that folder, they're not independently knowing to gather up those papers. They get lost, right? So we might have that visual schedule there for them and maybe make that picture for gathering papers more salient to them so that they're able to complete step 4 and continue on. So normally, again, correcting for errors in a task analysis would be backing it up to the previous point where they were independent, getting that success going again, and then adding in that step once you've broken that step into smaller chunks or made the prompt more salient or the cue more salient for them so that they can become independent. So task analyses are designed for procedural skills, right? You can break that skill down into smaller steps. You usually take data on plus, minus, or prompt, whether a student can do it independently or it needs prompts. You can do a variety of teaching techniques, including forward chaining, backward chaining, or total chain, right? Where you have all the steps introduced every single time, depending on the student's deficits. And then again, you take data across time to see if more steps are being done independently. They are often paired with visual schedules for a student because that is the combination that's appropriate for teaching a procedural skill. And then you set mastery criterion. Are you expecting that student to complete the task independently every single time across many days, or are you allowing some flexibility and some errors in your mastery criterion? But that is task analysis.